Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are or when you're watching this. My name is Jay Shamba. I'm the director at the Institute for International Economic Policy here at GW, or IIEP, as we like to call it. And we at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event on India at 75, part of our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located at the Elliott School at GW, and we are a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization, and that's a mandate we interpret rather broadly. So it includes international trade, international finance, development economics, poverty studies, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. And we've also had quite a focus on both China's economy and India's economy over the last number of years. And for those of you interested who haven't seen it before, we have a series, a speaker series called Envisioning India, about once a month over the last 18 months, where we have had quite some very, very interesting policy discussions led by Ajay Chhibber, who you'll hear from a little bit later on today. We've been very busy at IIEP over the last 18 months or so with a number of events that you can find on our website. We have upcoming events, but also all the older events are available in video form. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the IIEP Executive Circle and welcome any members who are in attendance today. But now what I'd like to do is turn things over to IIEP Distinguished Visiting Scholar Sunil Sharma, who is the organizer of today's event and will be moderating, and who's been organizing the series, Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy. So Sunil, over to you.
Thanks, Jay. Let me add my welcome to everybody. Today we have the 12th seminar in the series on Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy. As you know, that we've been addressing systemic issues. Today's topic is systemic challenges that India faces 75 years after independence. Many of the challenges that India faces are, of course, specific to India, but some of them are faced not just by India, other emerging markets, but also by developed capitalist democracies. As a preamble to today's discussion, let me make two remarks. First, the state versus market dichotomy is not useful. I find that it is rarely useful. We simply cannot treat the economy as a separate technical subsystem. The political, social, economic, and financial orders interact with each other. They are in turn dependent on the natural environment, and all these interactions produce a complex adaptive reality whose evolution is not easy to predict or control, especially given the current fragilities. Modern markets are institutions. They are not necessarily natural phenomena. They are economic institutions that must be designed, infrastructure provided, rules of the game established, regulatory frameworks crafted. Markets are also social institutions, and they are influenced by societal norms and culture. And historically, social and market behavior have determined the development of capitalism and the evolution of markets. And ultimately, their survival, their functioning, their stability depends on the relationship between governments, corporations, financial intermediaries, personal networks in society, and how power and influence are distributed. The corporation itself is a form created by society. And what we are seeing today in a networked, knowledge-intensive society is that we may have to, in some sense, create new corporate entities to deal with some of the challenges that we are facing. The second remark I want to make is that India is today a middle-income country. At the lower end of the middle-income scale, in the low-income phase, countries grow by factor accumulation, especially capital, building basic infrastructure, and efficient sectoral allocation of capital and labor. In the middle-income phase, countries deal with technological upgrading and intersectoral allocation of resources and become part of global supply chains. Institutional quality and industrial policies become important. Higher levels of skilled labor is needed, which in turn implies better education institutions and a deeper scientific establishment. Need for increased innovation implies competitive markets, entry and exit of firms, a thriving small and medium-sized firm ecosystem, a relevant business culture, norms of behavior, the rule of law to adjudicate contracts quickly and efficiently, and an appropriate regulatory framework for the economy, and a move to greater growth with equity, social safety nets, social services, and a responsive and effective government bureaucracy. This phase requires new kinds of soft and hard infrastructure and better governance. Now, over a decade ago, the phrase the middle income trap used by Indermeet Gill and Homi Karas became popular. I prefer the middle income blues because it is an empirical fact that countries remain in the middle income band for extended periods, but it is not an inevitability. Now, India has made a lot of progress since independence. At independence, India had a population of about 350 million. GDP in dollar terms was about 37-40 billion. Per capita income was about 90, and a literacy rate of about 12%. Today, the population is 1.4 billion. I mean, every time I verbalize that number, 1.4 billion, I'm just staggered. GDP of about 3.25 trillion in current dollar terms. It's about 11-12 in PPP terms. GDP per capita is about 2,300, or forecast to be about 2,300 this year, and PPP about 8,000, a literacy rate of 74%. And in PPP terms, India is the third largest economy in the world. Over 7 decades, India started with a progressive constitution. India is endowed with natural and human resources, no lack of entrepreneurial talent, and a great cultural, and I might add, culinary traditions. It is fair to say that India's performance in the first 75 years has fallen short of its potential and promise. Much has been accomplished, but a lot more needs to be done. Today, we have a distinguished scholar and a distinguished scholar practitioner to discuss what needs to be done. Ravinder Kaur is a historian of contemporary India. She is professor at the University of Copenhagen in the South Asian department, and she's the director of the Center for Global South Asian Studies. Her core research focuses on the processes of capitalist transformation in 21st century India. This is the subject of her most recent book, Brand New Nation, Capitalist Dreams and Nationalist Designs in 21st Century India. That was issued by Stanford University Press in 2020. This work was selected as one of the Financial Times Best Book of the Year in 2020 and also longlisted for the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay NIF Book Prize in 2021. She's also the author of Since 47, Partition Narratives Among the Punjabi Migrants in Delhi. A second edition was issued recently by Oxford University Press. Ajay Chhibber is a distinguished visiting scholar at George Washington University at IIEP and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Ajay is co-author along with Salman Soos of the recently published book, Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival, HarperCollins 2022. Ajay was the first Director General, Independent Evaluation Office, India, and he's been a distinguished visiting professor at the National Institute of Public Finance. He served as Assistant Secretary General at the UN, Assistant Administrator of the UNDP. At the World Bank, he was Country Director for Turkey and Vietnam and directed the 1997 World Development Report. He has a doctorate from Stanford and an MA from Delhi School of Economics, and he was my tutor at the St. Stephen's College when I was an undergraduate. With that, the floor is yours, Ravinder.
So thank you so much. And I'm really grateful that you invited me for this. I'm very, very honored. I think I'm going to begin with a sort of picture show for you. And much of my archival material, as I'm going to show you, is based on images and the whole question of what image economy, how it works, the brand making. Just a second, I just need to put on this slideshow, share screen. All right, so here it is. So I'm going to speak about basically what many of us have been talking about in terms of new India. So I'm going to, first of all, reflect on the process of what New India is and how it came to be. And finally, I will be speaking about what Sunil has already mentioned, a particular kind of trap that India may be caught in and how potentially to escape that as well. So I think I'm going to begin with this image. This image simply says open for business. And it is a term or phrase which is often found hanging outside commercial establishments. So when you say open for business, that means come into the shop. Now it is open for transactions. But what does it mean when such a sign is hung outside a nation state? What kind of product is being sold here? And this image that I'm showing to you is from 2002, and it was issued as part of the Incredible India campaign launched by the government of India. So basically, my entire work addresses the question that when and how did a nation turn into a market? What does it even mean for a nation to be considered a market? And my prime argument, which I'm offering, is that the long history, and this is where Francis Fukuyama comes in as well, which is the whole idea of the end of history that we are all familiar with, which proposed that, after the end of the Cold War, the world had turned into an open space for liberal markets. And this was something, which just did not, this is not just a story of India, but also the story of the largest third world, where the model was taken that now we need to turn India, a nation, into a market. And what it means is that we begin to reimagining the nation as, for example, a territory as a potential resource for natural, natural resources which can be commodified. Population is seen as a demographic dividend, which can also be capitalized. And indeed, this is where culture comes in, and culture can also be turned into a brand identity. The longer story of this is not very simple, as many of us are aware that the process is long drawn out, and something turned around in 1990s, where the old ideology or the battleground of Swadeshi, which basically means self-reliance, was sort of corroded. And these are some of the images that I'm showing you here from 1990s, when Coca-Cola, for example, came back to India. And in 1970s, Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, just because it was such a big brand, a global brand, it was one of the companies which was thrown out in the nationalization era. And soon after the restrictions were moved, Coca-Cola was one of the companies which came back as the first one. And here you can see some of the commentaries in the newspapers. This is from Times of India, which simply talks about Coca-colonization of India, because there is still a lot of confrontation or opposition to the idea that foreign companies should come to India. And yes, so, but yet the 1990s opening up of the markets also, that is something which continued. I'm not going into the longer history. I'm just throwing in some provocations and which we can return to. What you can see is that India begins to be conceived in a new way. And here, as you can see, we are looking at this compass, and we can see opportunity has a new geography, and it is moving southeast, south and eastwards. And this is where you begin to reimagine India as a place where there is hope and opportunity. And these ads, which I'm showing you, these were again issued by the government of India in the foreign press. This was not issued in India. I move on. And this story, as I said, is a wider story of the old third world, or the old post-colonial world, where I just have taken samples from the Economist Magazine, particularly because Economist Magazine, as many of you would be aware, from the mid-19th century, it has a particular kind of history as being a journal which has pushed forth the idea of liberal markets. So this is where you can see that the cover stories of the Economist, they shift towards India, China, Africa, and the entire language is of growth, of emergence, aspirations, and rise, etc. And of course, you can also see that there is this threat of China buying up the world. But all these are, from the first 2 decades of the 21st century, some of these examples that I'm showing you. And here, this is very interesting image, which simply says, "Can India fly?" And this image, basically, you can literally see chains, and where our Indians are actually trying to rise above the ground. And they have computers, because this is the time when India also comes to be associated with tech and Silicon Valley, etc. But at the same time, the idea that government is holding you back, that India needs to be unfettered, unshackled to realize its growth potential. So can India fly? And that actually became, something that a lot of people, a phrase which people begin talking about. So here it is that we need to consider how India came to imagine itself on the global stage as a place where FDIs flow, or the self-worth is created. And so this is what I'm trying to think in terms of enclosure of capital, that how nation state begins to be imagined, not in the old 19th century fashion, but the 21st century mode of rediscovery, where the flows of capital become the core of self identity. So here it is that many of us would be aware of the slogans of India Shining, or which 10 years later returned in terms of good times, or Achhe Din. What I'm trying to show you is that how an entire push towards middle class, or the growth, prosperity, or what I think in terms of dream worlds of capital, is, some of these imageries are, and by the way, this is an iconic image. Many of you would have seen this before, splashed in newspapers, etc. This basically is a cricket mom who, I mean, those of you who understand cricket would immediately see that she's actually losing out. She has made, she has lost the wicket. Am I right? And, but anyway, she's very happy and cheerful. And this is because, as the slogan says, expenses are settling, budgets are balancing, mothers are smiling, you have never had a better time to shine together. Now, interesting thing about this image and many others that I will show you is that these were not meant for the foreign audience. These were issued in India. And why? This was an internal push going on to make Indians realize that India is doing pretty well, that you need to invest in India and partake the growth. So this is what I call the icons of good times, this is, by the way, where we begin to see a shift in 2003-04, when the gains of liberalization sort of begin to kick in. And the earlier images that I show you, where there is still opposition in the early 1990s against the opening of the economy, that begins to shift over here. And this is the popular imagery of how one too can be part of the market growth model. Here you can see, I mean, these are just some samples. There are loads and loads of images of this kind, which were issued at the time, all by the Ministry of Finance, by the way. And here you can see a prosperous farmer, highways, technology, mobile. So in the beginning of the 21st century, this is what becomes the mainstay of how to imagine new India and new Indians. Here, so it is not just, when you begin to reimagine India and new Indians, what you also see is that this is where cultural shifts begin to take place as well. So what I am calling remixing history, again, is not something I invented. This is literally from an official campaign, which talks about how India is to be reimagined, the old civilizational culture, but in a global frame. So I'm just trying to take you through the makings of the imagination of New India. And if you see this woman, she's simply doing a yoga pose, but it is a globally, in the global aesthetics that anybody can understand that, and in lycra clothes and whatnot. So this is a global image of an Indian who is at home in the world. Here, this is very interesting. This is what was described to me as the smart image of India. And if you read what it says, not all Indians are polite, hospitable, and vegetarian. So this is like basically poking fun, because I was told by the designers that, look, it's not just about remaking images, it's also having smart personality. That Indians are those who are at home in the world and who can also crack jokes and not get offended by that, right? So these are just some examples of that. In New India was also imagined as an inclusive place. Pay attention that this is very visibly a Muslim image, but what it shows is that the idea of unity and diversity, which we are all familiar from 1950s, 60s, 70s, here it takes a shift where in order to be part of the nation, you have to be productive. And if you are productive and help generate growth, then you are New Indian too. And you can see the shift, the cultural economic shifts which are taking place, and where basically this is an example of small, medium entrepreneur who simply says, I make my India shine. So this is a certain kind of inclusiveness which has an economic basis. Okay, this was my own image. This is at the World Economic Forum, where in Davos, no, I just wanted to stop there. Basically, this is where I made much of my field work. This is where India basically pitches itself as an investment destination for the world. Final two remarks I have is, when we speak about India, New India emerging, we must recall that already in 2010, when President Obama visited India, he actually made a statement saying that India is not emerging, India has emerged. And that was taken as, and that please recall that this is happening at the height of India's growth curve, upward curve. So when we still say that India is being recognized or emerging, then we have to think, so what happened in the last 12 years? And this is where I think Sunil's point about getting trapped into some sort of phase where one is not moving, one is getting stuck, needs to be paid attention to. Then I would say, well, so what happened to that potential that we are witnessing, the imagery that I have shown you, what happened to that potential? I think one thing is that the question of distribution of wealth or investing in what is called social infrastructure has not happened in ways that it should have taken place. I think in the last few years, the hope that I was showing you has been corroded somewhat, and it has moved towards a little bit of pessimism. And this is why one is talking about how to recreate that potential. So I think this is where I would say that for the first time, we begin hearing in the last year or so, especially during the COVID period, that how there have been wild estimations. I'm not sure what to rely on, but anywhere between 75 million to 230 million people have fallen back into poverty. Now, there are various counts of what to do, but just to say that the hope which was generated in the beginning of the 21st century, that somehow is in a, sort of getting corroded. And this is where I would say that ways to, I don't have all solutions. I'm just laying out, some of the things to talk about. But I would say that we must pay attention not to just the economic question, but look at the social side of things, where development of the human potential is one of the key things that I would like to further reflect on. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that, Ravinder. I'll let Ajay speak for a little while, and then we can come back with questions and answers. So Ajay, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Let me apologize for my co-author, Salman, who could not join us today, but he has a good reason. He's actually moved to Abu Dhabi, and he's teaching at the moment. Right at this moment, he's actually teaching a class. So I must say, my co-author has become a professor as well, and I'm so overawed by people who teach. I tried to teach for 1 year, and Sunil happened to be a student in my class, and I discovered that this was not my profession, so I gave it up. And I also discovered a very strong correlation between people who never attended my class and did well in life later, such as Sunil. He must have bunked my class. So anyway, back to the subject. Sunil, I have a feeling that, when I was preparing for this one, I said, this book must have actually been written for this particular event, because the book, what it does is Unshackling India, Hard Truths and Clear Choices for Economic Revival. It does look back over the last 75 years, exactly. But then it also looks forward as to what we need to do over the next 25 years, so that by the time we we get the 100th year of our independence, which is at 2047, then some of those promises, the pictures, the nice pictures that Professor Ravinder just showed us, those promises would actually be realized. Now, in looking back and kind of picking up a little bit of what you just heard, we've had of course, the role of the state has changed, and I'll come to that, but we've had many strong leaders who have tried to brand things. So, it's not a new phenomenon, as new perhaps as you might think. Of course, we've had Shining India, and now under Prime Minister Modi, we've had lots of slogans, lots of branding. Make in India, Skill India, Clean India, or Swachh Bharat, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which means everybody together and everybody for development. I mean, the current Prime Minister is known for his ability to put out branding items. But, we've had this before as well. We had Prime Minister Nehru, who kind of said agriculture has to be the basis of our development, but then did everything in the opposite. I mean, he almost destroyed Indian agriculture with his push for heavy industrialization. And then we had Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who had Garibi Hatao. Her big slogan was remove poverty. And during her time, probably India saw the largest increase in the number of poor people. So, and then we had Shining India, where the government was actually thrown out of power partly maybe because of that slogan. So one of the things that why we write Hard Truths and Clear Choices is that there's just too much of this branding going on. And the hard reality is what we need to focus on. What are the basics, foundations of India's economic development that we need to, that our book has tried to lay out in considerable detail in different parts of the economy and society. in terms of the title of your series, Capitalism and Democracy, India has managed to stay democratic and quite a unique, as a developing country, very few countries have sustained democracy for such a long period of time. Certainly, all our neighbors have not. And there are very few countries in the world that have been able to do that consistently for the last 75 years, which India has been able to do. But on all rankings of democracy, as you know, Sunil, better than I, and probably Professor Ravinder knows better than I, India has fallen on the democracy indicators all over the world. And in our book, we say that some people now say it's more an electrocracy than a democracy. It's very much, we have elections. We have so many elections all the time, not only at the central level, but also at the state level. And when you have 29 states, you have elections almost all the time in India. So we are more an electrocracy than a democracy, and the institutions of democracy are actually getting weaker and weaker. And on capitalism, we have a lot of terminology now of the kind of capitalism we have. We have Arvind Subramaniam calling it stigmatized capitalism. We have Raghuram Rajan also coining a phrase similar to that. And in our book, we call it some form of ersatz capitalism, a kind of pseudo-capitalism with state capture. Now, one indicator of that we've seen all these numbers that Sunil read out to you about the rise in GDP per capita, and especially after the 1991 liberalization, we've seen rapid increase in growth, but we've also seen a huge increase in inequality. And here's a picture from one of Piketty's pictures, Thomas Piketty. And what the pandemic has done is, of course, has made this inequality even worse. So India is now, as you can see here, the fastest increase in inequality among the major economies in the world, and now at a level close to the kind of inequality you see in Latin America and South Africa. And it indicates clearly that this middle income trap that Sunil talked about, we are very much headed in that direction of being stuck in a middle income trap with this kind of rising inequality of the kind that you've seen in many countries that are stuck so-called in the middle income trap. Now, one of the themes, so we have several themes in our book, and I don't think I'll have time to go through all of them, but the one big theme, of course, is the role of the state. And we argue very much that the state, despite the 1991 liberalization, and despite all this branding that you've heard about, market is open, etc., the state in India remains far too interventionist. It gets into so many things and does them all very, very badly. So to have a thriving capitalistic economy, you need an effective state. It's not a state versus market issue, as Sunil said, but you also do need an effective state. Without an effective state, you can't really have markets functioning. Without proper regulatory systems, you can't have markets functioning. We've had now the state intervene in almost everything and doing it badly, and now you have state capture of enormous proportions. That then means that the kind of market capitalist economy that India has very much going in the direction of what we call ersatz capitalism. So we lay out what needs to be done, of course, in that we need to move the state to doing much fewer things, and then doing some of those things much better. And the most basic things the state in India is doing very badly, which is defense. Actually, our defense spending is now the lowest as a share of GDP, despite the fact that we have threats from neighbors, and I wouldn't necessarily name them, but we have plenty of, we live in a tough neighborhood, let me put it that way. We also have very low spending on the basics like health and education. And now we are starting to move a little bit better in those areas, but it still remains very low. So one of the basic themes we argue, and this is this is where the unshackling bit comes in, that is that we need to not necessarily have a smaller state, but we need a state much more focused on providing first the basic fundamentals and getting out of a lot of things which it should not be involved in. We also have a very centralized state. And I hear, we contrast with China, which is a totalitarian communist government. But yet more than 50% of spending in China is done not at the central level, not even at the provincial level, but at the local government level, the county level, or the city mayor level, or the village commune level. In India, that number is less than 5%. And we use a framework that was actually developed at the World Bank by Arturo Israel to show why this sort of centralization leads to such inefficient outcomes. Because as he shows, he's a public administration expert who showed that you can think about breaking down government activities by specificity, how specific are their outcomes, and by the volume of transactions. And that those activities which have very high transaction volume and very low specificity in terms of measuring performance, like health and education, hard to do or hard to attribute what performance is due to. They are best devolved to much lower levels of government, because there you have a much closer interaction. Like you have in the US, you have in the developed world, you have schools being run at the county level. So this is kind of the framework that we adopt in the book on this. Talking about branding, the other big theme and we pick up on this branding issue by giving the example of the ease of doing business index. India, before the Modi government came to power, was ranked 140th in the world on the ease of doing business. But yet, during that period, when we were 140th, there were years where we saw very huge increases in investment, in private investment. Since the Modi government came to power, they focused heavily on the ease of doing business. And I had been warning them for some time that this is not a very good index, and you probably shouldn't waste your time on it. But they went ahead. And Mr. Modi decided that he wanted India's ranking on the ease of doing business, because it sells well in places like Davos, etc. It is to come in the top 50th as a start. And in 4 or 5 years, they were able to do it. They were actually now, just before the pandemic, they were at the 67th position. And but yet during this period, investment actually crashed. Because it is an index that is so easy to gain. And the cost of doing business has actually been going up in India. So I can talk more on the other, so that's a huge theme of our book, where we lay out why that is the case, why the cost of doing business is so high. We also talk a lot about the, feminization of the economy, the sex ratio, the very low labor force participation rate for women. We talk about the fact that our entire transformation has been very lopsided, because we have taken our most abundant factor of production, labor, and made it very hard for people to actually get genuine employment. So you end up with very few people actually entering the workforce. Our overall labor force participation rate is about less than 50%, and it's 20% for women. And you end up with, let me see here. I'm just going to skip a few. Yeah. So we've ended up with, you know, a very lopsided transformation with what Danny Roderick calls it premature deindustrialization in India. And part of that is because we've used our most abundant factor of production very badly. And those who actually do have some jobs also, the ratio of vulnerable employment, this is coming from the UNDP's Human Development Report, in India is a complete outlier of this, as you can see. 77% of those who actually have a job have very vulnerable employment. And this was exposed during the pandemic in spades when millions of people were streaming back to the villages. Our most scarce factor of production, land, we use very badly. This is just an example of floor area ratios, where our floor area ratios are among the lowest in the world in our cities. So we use our land very well. And so we have these sprawling cities very badly managed. And then we have one of the most inefficient banking systems in the world, measured by the intermediation ratio, you know, lending to deposit rates, etc. So anyway, I don't want to go into more detail. I can give you a lot. There's a lot in the book, but the main point I'm trying to make, we were trying to make in this book is that branding aside, we need to focus on the fundamental foundations of development, health, education, ask the question why such a large part of our population, the female population, is so underutilized. We need to focus on fixing some of these things that increase the costs of doing business so hugely, the labor laws, the way land is being used, and the financial system. And increasingly what we find is that the reforms we did in 1991 are now being reversed. We liberalized to the rest of the world hugely in 1991. And now, since 2018, we have seen a very sharp increase in tariffs and protectionism. And a very worrisome reversal in a way. What India needs is to be able to compete in the world. And as we say in our book, if the world's second largest economy, China, the third largest economy, Japan, the fourth largest economy in the world, Germany, are such aggressive players in the global markets, why does India think that reverting back to protectionism under Fortress India will benefit India's growth performance? So let me stop here, Sunil, because I can go on and on, but you know, just to give you a flavor of the book and kind of where we come out. But we also, of course, focus a lot on the next 25 years and argue that the big challenge of climate change, India has a unique opportunity now, because only 20% of the infrastructure that we will need in 2047 has been put on the ground, unlike the developed world and even China, which has already plonked a lot of its infrastructure. So we have a great opportunity to grow now, and a unique opportunity because nobody else can show us the path. Those who developed before us developed in a very CO2 intensive manner and energy intensive manner. And so India has to find a way to go forward and grow from the $2,000 that you mentioned to $14,000, $15,000 by 2047, but has to do it with a much smaller carbon footprint. But we try and show in our book that there lies the opportunity as well for India, because the jobs, the green growth economy can create a lot of jobs if done right. And then we also have somewhat of an advantage in the IT sector, which we should now use to not fight new technologies and artificial intelligence, but to adopt it and make India a world beater in that. So we look forward in a very positive way, but we do point out what's and all, where we are and what we need to fix. Let me stop.
Great. Thanks so much, Ravinder and Ajay, for that quick overview. I mean, India is, like I said, a really complex reality. And I'm going to try and dig deep a little bit more into this whole issue that we are India is in the lower middle income phase, and that what is needed, and as I think both you and Ajay pointed out, both in terms of reimagining what we can do, there has to be a change in the way expectations are molded and changed, because unless we have a contagion of positive expectations, given the task that India faces, and given the kinds of transformations that both you have outlined, the soft infrastructure, the hard infrastructure is not going to be easy to create. And they have to be done in many ways simultaneously. For example, we have to start thinking in terms of urbanization, how to make sure that the megacities are livable, how we create connectivity between the major cities and the provincial cities. And it has to be done quickly, given the climate stresses that we are bound to face. So let me start with the soft infrastructure first. So let's, as both of you pointed out, that going forward in a service-oriented, highly networked, information and knowledge-intensive economy, human capital is going to be key. So how do you see the transformation taking place? Because for human capital transformation, first we need health, education, women's education, all kinds of gender issues to start with, and social services. So let's start with the soft infrastructure.
Okay, shall I respond?
Sure, please.
All right, so I think these are, and I think it in a way very nicely dovetailed what I was saying and what Dr. Chhibber was later saying. And of course, our basis is different. He was showing graphs and I was showing pictures, but actually it is telling the same story of, upward climb and erosion. I think I'll begin by saying that key to this indeed is state-capital relations and the term called market. Now it's an English term and everybody thinks that they understand what market is. But I think we sometimes understand it in a very different way. And at least this is what my guess is, that it needs a conceptual translation, that when in India, policymakers talk about market, or at least the way we see schemes being implemented, it is almost like if you withdraw, this withdrawal of the state and opening of the market in itself is seen as a solution. And I can give you loads of examples that how it has worked. And this is so important because state is never, state is never going to really disappear. It never has. The picture that I was showing you from the World Economic Forum, basically that tells us the story of state-capital relations, whether invisible or visible. And as Dr. Chhibber has already pointed out, state is very much visible, but what role does it play? And I think, I'm sitting in Denmark, which is a highly capitalist society, but at the same time, it's also a social welfare state. State is very interventionist, but at the same time, what you can see is that the social side of what I call the social infrastructure, or what you call the soft side, human development, education, health, or the general facilities for the development. I mean, they are simply available. What some people think is free, but it is funded by public, taxes. So I think what has happened in India is, please recall that when Dr. Manmohan Singh in UPA 1 and 2, when he was the prime minister, he did actually initiate some very key policies, right to food, right to work, etc., which many people were not happy with. And I think that was a kind of realization that market alone, and by this meaning, this vile kind of thing that supply and demand is somehow going to create growth. And no. distribution is what the state needs to step into do. So when when UPA government introduced right to food and right to work, that was a realization that state needs to step into, and that actually made quite a huge amount of difference. So I would say that we need to think about that, how a very strange kind of, among some neoliberal policymakers in India that has crept in, namely, like books like India Grows at Night, that government is the problem, government is seen as an obstruction. And I think this is actually a very strange, it's a very ahistorical understanding of how state society has functioned. I don't know if it makes sense, but I just feel, I like the point Dr. Chhibber was making, that it's not about big or small state, minimal state or maximum state. Literally, it is about how efficient the state is, and in which areas would it intervene, and where it should not intervene, and which we can discuss, like in the sense like social strife we are talking about, which is also unfolding in India. And he mentioned how some of the democratic infrastructures are being eroded. That is important. That is not where the state needs to literally intervene and create strife. There they must go back, whereas there are other areas where the state needs to intervene, which is not happening.
Okay, so Ajay, so the whole issue of human capital, I mean, the focus has to be on human capital, and so that's one of the basics, right, in terms of health, education, gender issues. Given the state in which we are now, to make the big push, are there a few things that we can do to get the ball rolling, to catalyze certain forces that will allow us to make big changes in the time period we're thinking about?
Yeah, so I think clearly what we have shown in the book, and I can say, bring up more graphs, but I don't want to bore you with graphs. We are clearly underspending hugely as a public spending on health and education, which means out-of-pocket expenses of people are very high. 67% of the health spending in India is out of pocket. And now they have started a scheme, Ayushman Bharat, they call it. It's a health insurance scheme, but it's right now it's so small compared to, they've reached, I think, maybe 1 crore people, which is about 10 million people, and they need to reach 100 crore people. So that's going to take a long time. So we need more public spending in health and education, and we don't need it at the national level. We need it at the local level. Now, Delhi government, by the way, I'm told, is showing the way forward with these mohalla clinics and very big focus in Delhi on public education. And Delhi is a state, but I consider it not a complete full-size state anyway. But so so we need to spend more. But what I discovered when I went back to India as the Director General of Independent Evaluation was that since 91, India said, we are not going to do directed planning, we're going to do indicative planning, right? So, but then what they did was, they said, so they focused a lot on the social sectors. And by that, what the central government meant was, they will have central government schemes, education for all and health and all kinds of flagship central schemes, where central money will be provided for social sectors, which were actually state subjects, right? So, but by doing that, what they did was they tied the hands of the states also, because what they would do is they would say, we will provide 65% of the resources for this education scheme, and 35% will be provided by the state. If the state does not provide the 35, it doesn't get the 65. So this made it inevitable that the states would have to now shift whatever resources they were getting from the Finance Commission towards this particular way of doing education, or this particular way of doing health, etc. The point I'm trying to make is a broader one, which is that we have to spend more, but we have to spend it at the right level as well. It can't be as I showed you with that Arturo Israel methodology, this is not something where the central government can design an education scheme for the whole country. It can provide an overarching framework for what are the basic yardsticks that we want. Similarly, in health, it cannot do that. So these are areas where we need both more money, for sure we need more money. And then where shall we get that money? We will get that money because we are sitting still on 235 state-owned enterprises, the legacy of our sort of Nehruvian past, which they are now trying to, which are, some of them make money, but a lot of them lose a lot of money. And I did a huge study on this when I was at NIPFP, some of which we have summarized in the book. And we just sold Air India, for example, back to the Tatas, which was these were bleeding ulcers, basically, not some shining ratnas of our economy. So we need to get out of this business and focus that money on health and education and basic infrastructure that will lay the foundation. Now, health outcomes, as I have learned after many years working around the world, is not just dependent on health spending. There are a lot of mothers' education, clean water, etc. Many things go into making health outcome. Nutrition, of course, is very important. So all that has to be put together. So just having a health scheme doesn't solve your health outcome, right? So what we have tried to do in the book is to say, look at things in an integrated way. If you want more employment, you'll need to do a lot of different things to get more employment. Setting up a scheme called Mahatma Gandhi Employment Guarantee Scheme is not, that's a safety net. That's not a job creating. You need mechanisms for the private sector to be creating jobs and hiring people, right? So we try and do this throughout the book in a systematic, how do these systems work that interact with each other to produce these outcomes that we are seeing? And that's what we try.
Let me intervene there and ask you this question. I mean, I'm pushing a little more on human capital because I think that's, in some sense, as Ravinder and both of you have pointed out, that branding is all very well, but in some sense, to have a sustainable transformation, we have to change the expectations of the people, but we have to also change some very fundamental basics on the ground. So let me push a little further on the whole issue of gender inequality. I mean, this is part and parcel also of other kinds of inequalities. For example, when I look at the map of India, where we look at inequality by state, right? I mean, and you look at say poverty numbers in Kerala and Karnataka and Punjab, they're less than 5%. Where you look at inequality numbers in Bihar, it's over 50%, using certain measures of poverty, or in UP, they're probably over 30%. So we have a centralized federal state dealing with a really diverse collection of states and their both state and local governance. We have a multiplicity of languages, and we have subcultures. How can the state make these changes with, say, limited state capacity, if we want in this sort of diversity to make serious changes and say that in the next 10 years or in the next 15 years, we're going to empower women, we're going to educate the mothers, and that will massive benefits for the next generation. Ravinder, you want to?
Yes, no, I think I wanted to, because I've written a book on branding, so I just want to add one bit about this. It's about, of course, there is nothing new about selling something, like exporting or making trademarks. These are, very old things. We have always done that. But there is something different about, that we can also use campaigns to inform, to drum up hope, optimism, as I've shown in many of those pictures. Those pictures are, the graphs which Dr. Chhibber has shown. Not everyone will understand, because this is what policymakers understand, right? Specialists, experts. But the images that I showed you of progress, prosperity, happiness, everyone understands, right? So this is where schemes get translated into the popular domain. So of course, images can play an amazing role in drumming up expectations, as you say. I think there is something about learning right lessons and wrong lessons out of this whole branding schema. And I think this is where, something has happened in the last few years that, this spectacle in itself has become something which can, it's as a form of governance. You can just go and see, as I think it has been mentioned, we have so many slogans, so many schemes. Everything has amazing, smashing websites and hashtags, and there is a publicity machinery which is unmatched, right? But there is this huge gap right along between that. For example, who has even heard? I remember, I think just a few years ago, the huge IU scheme, when it was launched, it was celebrated all over the world's biggest healthcare scheme. But we haven't heard about what precisely has happened about it, and so on and so forth. There are so many schemes. Like, so what happened to Digital India, or what happened to even Make in India, right? So it has a brilliant logo, brilliant website, but what is happening, So the point is learning right lessons and wrong lessons. I think we may have learned wrong lessons out of it, that as if publicity in itself is a substitute for actual governance. And this is where we are seeing that much of the groundwork, like something which needs like sincere sort of, investment in the population, how strong, like how many diseases, do Indians have, or, what is the level of, like what kind of nutrition one gets. And as I said, we have heard this phrase again and again, that so many millions have been lifted out of poverty, and that we continue to hear throughout the last 30 years or so. But in the last couple of years, the reverse happens. And I think that was pretty stunning when that paper came out. I suppose from some scholars at Azim Premji University. And then after that, there was a whole floodgate of many such reports, which basically showed that actual poverty is increasing. And that has to be taken note of, that the mismatch between, that the kind of lessons we may have learned out of the branding thing, that it is merely something which can drum up hopes, expectations, and tell people, come on, go and get things done. But it is not the only thing. But this is where I think we have got stuck as well.
Good, thanks. So, I mean, there are a lot of questions, and I just want to tell all the participants, please send in your questions. And in fact, Jyoti Banerjee has sent in a few questions, and I think you've answered that, saying that branding is all very well, but we have to be digging into the substance. The reason why I asked the question on gender is that in some sense, gender, education, skill levels, and more inclusiveness and greater secularism, they all go hand in hand. I mean, the women's education is so crucial for the next generation, and so on and so forth. And the question is, we can't do them separately. This has to be done collectively, and to make the big push. By the way, I have questions coming in, and there are lots of other questions I have. So can we just
on gender? Gender, can I just say one thing?
Sure.
So what we show in our book is that the female. So there are lots of social factors that reduce female labor force participation, perhaps, but we contrast India with Bangladesh. Bangladesh has seen a huge increase in female labor force participation ever since the textile industry took off in Bangladesh. So that has generated, so there's a demand side issue here also, that when there are no jobs, where will these people go for looking for jobs, right? I mean, there's safety issues, there are social, patriarchal society, all those problems are there. But yet in Bangladesh, a part of South Asia, you haven't seen that in Pakistan, you haven't seen that in India. You have seen a huge increase in female labor force participation. Okay, the jobs they have are not, they're back-breaking jobs in some textile factories, not in very good conditions. There was, that fire in the Rana Plaza. All those problems are there, but yet the girls are coming from villages because it's the job they get there pays more, it's better than what they were doing back home, unpaid, backbreaking work. So all these things are in a way linked together as well. That we are starting now to see huge increases in education among girls. But if there are no jobs for them, where will they go, right? I mean, so those are the kind of issues we need to talk about. I lived in Vietnam and I worked a lot in East Asia. The most successful countries had much less branding, actually. So you have, Truly Asia, Malaysia, then you have places like Indonesia trying to brand themselves. But Vietnam, China, Korea, Japan, much less branding going on there, much more focus on getting the basics right and going competitive by forcing your companies to challenge themselves in global markets.
So I just want to make sure that people understand that they should be sending in their questions on chat, and we will try and collect them and summarize them. So let's look on the flip side now, right? Because the flip side of all this is that given India's current needs, yes, we have to transform human capital. We have to transform on the factor market side. Where are the jobs going to come from, or how quickly can the jobs be created? Because we need a huge number of jobs being created now. If people are, if in some sense India is going to reap the demographic dividend, because if we can't employ them productively, this is going to become a demographic burden rather than a dividend. So the question is, what kind of reforms in the job creation side? What can we do quickly to create the jobs that are needed? Both low-skilled jobs, given India's diversity, as well as the high-skilled jobs, to all the way to what I want to call a tech ecosystem, which can function with some state support, but by largely in the private sector. How does that come about in transforming the factor markets?
I mean, I can just chip in a little bit, which is that, first of all, I don't think so there are any quick solutions, quick fixes here. But what we must notice is that in India, where we do not actually have the social welfare infrastructure to cushion your fall, actually most people are in some sort of work or the other, or which is, many of which is undocumented, the large informal labor force. And what often you would say is that it's not about whether people are, working or not. It's about how well paid or not well paid they are. They may be underpaid for the type of work people do. It's a very small segment in India which can actually live off, people who own property and they can rent it out and then continue to make a living. But the large population of India is always working to end needs. So what I'm trying to say is that, first of all, put in perspective that when we speak about unemployment or people say we need jobs, I think they are speaking about certain kind of jobs, because in order to make your living, you always need to work.
Yes,
so
I
think
I understand that. So Ajay, you wanted to respond, yes?
So I think Professor Ravinder said it right. I mean, there are no quick fixes here, okay? So and the quick fixes can actually be quite damaging. They have just announced in India this PLI scheme, production linked incentive scheme, in 12 sectors to supposedly to attract companies that might be leaving China. Although I think we lost that bus already left the station. But anyway, but most of these are very capital intensive sectors. They're not going to create that many jobs. But in any case, let's see how it works. I'm still agnostic on the whole thing. But the foundations are still very weak, right? You need to have a competitive economy. And we show in our book, what are the elements of that competitiveness? Why is the cost of doing business so high that you can't then compete with the rest of the world and export and create jobs in that manner? And we go through that process. This whole business about well, we must have more SMSEs. You know, as Ravinder is saying, 80, in our book, we point out a number that 85% of these so-called SMEs are actually one person. There's one person employed. This is the guy with the ready and going and selling his stuff. They're not creating any jobs. Then you set up Mudra Bank, you set up all these schemes to give them money and all. This is not the way to create jobs. The way the East Asians created jobs was they had big leading firms exporting. And then they had a whole network of firms that were supplying supply chains to these bigger firms. And that's the way you create a network of firms. So this big companies are bad and small companies are good. This is not very helpful when you have to compete with the rest of the world. And the average, if your average firm size is less than 10, you are not going to compete. Today, Bangladesh is doing well in textile because the average firm size in Bangladesh is now about 600 workers. That's the kind of scale you need to be able to at least understand what your market is and how you will respond to that market. You can't have firms with 5 people then competing in that market. So my main point is to create jobs, you think of competitiveness, and that's how you will create the jobs. Now, I must say that the one area where there's a debate about whether we should go with services or manufacturing, and I keep saying, I heard even Raghuram Rajan the other day talking about it. And I said, why do we have to choose? We should certainly push ahead in the service sector, because that's where we have some sort of a leader advantage. But that's not going to create all the jobs we need. But nevertheless, we shouldn't lose those either. We should push on that and then work on the manufacturing sector so that we stop deindustrializing. So I don't see why people bring up, why should we focus on manufacturing? We'll never work out in let's focus on service. Well, do both.
By the way, somebody just sent me something that the chat is not working, but I am getting questions, and I think you guys can be able to see the questions too. So let me move on, because I mean, we've got so much to cover and we don't have a lot of time. Let's hit a few more highlights of what we could cover. I mean, questions have come in saying that, again, this is related to, I think, the broader question of governance, that unless we can create the channels of governance in such a way that they're not corrupted, whether they're in the public sector or in the private sector, and we can, in some sense, break the nexus which prevents large-scale change from happening, how will that happen?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I wanted to just mention that we have a chapter. So we have a whole section on corruption and different ways to address it. But before I come to that, let me say the chapter on the financial sector, we wrote it as Murder on the Orient Express. It's like everybody had their knives into it. So politicians, populist and corrupt, crony capitalists, the regulatory system as well. And many of my friends who have been RBI governors or deputy governors were not happy with that. And the bank managers. So corruption is rampant in the system. And we produce all the numbers also in the chapter on the state. And this myth that it has gone down, actually it has gone up. And Ravinder would know more, Professor Ravinder would know more about electoral corruption, but they have now set up this whole scheme of electoral bonds, which means that now you're not corrupt anymore. You just can donate money to any party without even revealing your identity. So they've corporatized the whole corruption system. Probably they followed the US example. Anyway, the point we are trying to make is that there are systematic ways where there's more competition, more transparency, more and better enforcement. I mean, there are mechanisms by which countries have gone from very corrupt systems to less corrupt systems. they have not gone about it by demonetization, which is what our government tried to do. They've gone about it with a systematic effort to, make things more IT related, more transparent, publication of bidding on parliamentary websites, greater parliamentary scrutiny, the whole gamut, the hard yard, so to speak, rather than some gimmickry way of trying to say, well, I'm going to demonetize tomorrow and reduce corruption.
So let me ask the question to both of you. So how do you see the role of the legal system? Because in many ways, in a capitalist democracy, you need a legal system that allows you to contain corruption, contain regulatory capture, and at the same time, you needed to adjudicate contracts and sort of emerging legal issues that are going to arise in the new network and knowledge economy. So what is the role, or what kind of reforms do we possibly need on the legal side to actually support both democracy and capitalism?
You may not remember him, but he was 1 year senior to me in college. Ranjan Gogoi, he became the Chief Justice of India. And after he became the Chief Justice of India, he wrote a book in which he said, if I had to take a case of my personal case, I wouldn't go to the court system. So, he made an admission that the legal system is so bad that even if I had a case of my own, I wouldn't go to the courts to get it adjudicated on. So we have a huge problem there. But in the Azim Premji survey that was done on institutions, I don't know how and why the Supreme Court came out looking quite good. But the rest of the court system, as you and I know, and all of us know, if you have to take your case to court, you mean you already admitted that you lost the case. So we do need a very big reform there. And again, it has to do a lot. So we are spending very little money. Of course, you need a lot more judges. You need a lot more computerization. You have a lot more resources that are needed there, but also you need much greater transparency in the process itself. I'm not an expert on this subject, but we cite various studies in the book, or citing others to point to some of these directions.
Ravinder, you want to add to that? Yes.
I would very quickly add that, in order to understand what worked and not worked, we both have to look at the history of India itself and also the history of China, because India and China are the only two countries which have that comparable size and scale. Often people say that, oh, well, things don't work in India because India is so huge, so complex, et cetera, et cetera. But all we have to do is to look at the neighboring China, and where we can see, what has worked and what has not worked. And of course, I think I'm trying to point out to a recent work which has appeared, which is called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And also the work of Professor Arunabh Ghosh, which is amazing, which actually tells you that the kind of choices China made in 1950s, 60s, 70s, and on, and this is a communist state, by the way. So they were literally investing massively in the social, on the social side of things. And please, everyone knows that China was far behind India in 1950s. And things which have, I come back to Indian history, the things which have really stood India in good ground were some of the investments made in the field of education, for instance. And I think I would come to the gender question also. Somebody like me, I have studied in public universities in India, in University of Delhi and University of Jawaharlal Nehru University. And as everyone knows that for girls, families are ready to spend money on their bedding in order to, create that whole, social prestige, etc. But they are more reluctant to spend money on their education. And this is even in middle class or well-off families. But I was able to study because all I had to do was, to clear the entrance exam, and I could pay literally the fee out of my own pocket. What I'm trying to say is that infrastructures, even if they were limited, but in a previous era, there was focus on those things. Whereas what we see at this moment is that universities or higher education institutions itself have become sites of conflict. I think this must be pointed out that there is huge amount of conflict going on. For example, University Grants Commission, or like many major universities which bring us accolades on the world stage, including IITs and whatnot. They are actually being undermined and weakened. So when we think about, when we think about that, well, what is going to happen in the future in the next 25 years, we are literally creating the foundation of that generation of how it is going to be. And that doesn't look very pretty. Of course, I mean, we want to be optimistic and hopeful, and there are many things to be hopeful about, but I think it would be very naive for us to overlook as to what is happening in the education sector. So if we don't do that, what I'm trying to say is that we have to learn lessons, from China, not the wrong lessons. What is great about India is that it has been able to create those democratic foundations, right? But at the same time, we haven't learned the things which we should have learned from China. And the gender question is also like across India, you can see wherever there is more gender equality, those regions in India are doing very well also on the economic side. And we can just map economic well-being with the social well-being.
So I think we're running out of time. We've got about 5-6 minutes to go. No, so given our discussion today, and as when we started off with the fact that India in the middle income band, to move, it has to create a different kind of transformation than just physical infrastructure. Now, clearly, in India's case, physical infrastructure is very important too, but this whole soft governance and associated institutions is going to be a big challenge. Now, so given the current structures, given the current politics, let me ask you a final question. So two of you, so both of you can respond. If you were told that you can do 3 things or 4 things, don't worry about the sequence, but here are the 3 or 4 nodes in which we can try and change this complex reality, what would you do?
Okay. Well, okay, this is a very tough question. I mean, at least for me, but I think maybe one thing is that I would like to revisit the 1990s, because there were some things which did take place in India, which turned around India on a different path as well. And one very important thing is that our energies are tremendously consumed by massive battles which are taking place in India. And these are cultural battles. And the fact that, the path of progress or development that has been conjoined to a different kind of, remaking of India into a majoritarian state. And I think if the population is in strife, I mean, the human capital or the people of the country, then I don't think so it bodes very well. So in order to do that, it's a very big wish, but I would say that, that trust in the political processes needs to be returned. And that's not an easy thing at all, because that connects many little dots that we were talking about, the legal system, or in our media, or, the entire political sphere. And I think this is perhaps which is different in 1990s, when India was on the brink of, loan default and in a total economic crisis, but then it made a swing, a turnaround. So what was at least different at that time was that the country was more in a way like ready to move. And by the way, 1980s, 70s was also the time when there were a lot of the so-called ethnic conflicts in different parts of India. And then it became a healing process. that let's move on, let's do something different. And I think that we must not underestimate the value of emotions here. That when the population is saying, all right, let's move on, let's do this. I think that is something where I believe hard work is involved and sincerity, where realization that India is not a political party. India is a country of 1.4 billion people with a long history and a lot of responsibility. And I think this is where I think one gets disappointed, that there is a sense of, that it cannot be a partisan political project.
Ajay, quickly.
So I would say, when we became independent, it was a union of states, right? It was a difficult time. There was heavy centralization to keep the country together, right? And we have had many battles with several states wanting to secede, etc. And those that we wish would secede never applied to secede, but that's a joke. But what I'm trying to say is, this is now a time to say, you cannot run this vast country of 1.4 billion with such diversity, and it's more diverse than the European Union, in a very centralized manner. So I think that decentralization and below the state level, in fact, in our book, we say India should have 50 states, not 29, but we have to go below that. So that's number one. Number two, I think we have to go back to the fundamentals of human capital formation, that we have to spend and focus much more on learning and education and health. Those two things are very, very critical, I think, going forward. And the third thing, I think I would, since you asked for three, I would argue that we have to, focus on the fact that we are now becoming a very unequal country, unequal in the numbers I gave you, but also across states, it's not converging, it's actually diverging. And that we have to address the system that is not creating the jobs that we need, because the way to solve inequality is not to just tax rich people and give handouts to the poor people, but more hand-ups to people to be able to create the jobs. That's where we need to focus.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting discussion. We've just run out of time. And so given I started off with two remarks. One was that it's a really, really complex reality. And two, that we are India is in the middle income band. And I think what both of you are in some sense saying is that to deal with this complexity, we definitely need multi-layered governance in some sense, from that India needs to start focusing on human capital, create individual agency, then at the local level, at the state level, and then at the federal level. And that how it does that, given the current institutional structure, is going to be the big challenge going forward. So I think in many ways, what you guys have said is absolutely correct. The focus has to be on people. Of course, we need infrastructure, but the people have to be the focus, health, education, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, we have to have both federal guidance, but decentralization at the same time. And that's the only way to create a resilient society. I think you have to create minimal agency. You have to try and make sure that the poor have access to move up, because otherwise, given the climate stresses that we are facing, it will not create a resilient society. Okay, with that, let me end. Thank you so much, both of you. I would urge everyone to read their books. They're delightful reads, and I guarantee you'll enjoy them. So thank you both very much. And thank you everyone for joining us, and good day wherever you are.